In the vast and cold reaches of deep space, aboard the derelict research vessel Chimera, a man named Dr. Ansel Grady drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. The ship hummed faintly, a mechanical lullaby of failing life support systems and groaning hull integrity. Ansel was the last human on board, or so he desperately hoped. The events that led to his isolation were fragmented in his mind, memories half-formed and suffused with a dull, gnawing terror. There had been whispers of the Echo, an experiment designed to tap into parallel dimensions, harvesting exotic particles from the so-called quantum veil. What began as a prestigious endeavor, funded by the mightiest of corporate overlords, had quickly descended into chaos. The project's lead, Dr. Elena Syra, had insisted they were on the verge of breakthroughs. And then came the incident. Ansel's mind flinched away from the details, like a finger brushing a live wire. His hands shook as he adjusted the air circulation panel, releasing a hiss of stale oxygen mixed with something faintly metallic. Every breath tasted faintly of rust and regret. He glanced at the darkened corner of the room, where shadows seemed to pool unnaturally. It was not just the absence of light. It was an absence, as though something gnawed away at the fabric of reality, leaving holes for the unthinkable to seep through. 3 days earlier, or was it weeks, the Veil oscillator had activated for the 113th test. Elena's voice had been unusually calm over the intercom, her words betraying none of the stress that had weighed on the crew for months. Stabilizing resonance. Particle density increasing. Ansel, watch the containment field. I'm detecting some fluctuations. He'd been sitting at the secondary station, nervously glancing at the oscillating graph on his screen. His chair felt unusually cold beneath him, as though the ship itself had grown hostile to its occupants. Containment holding steady, he muttered. No signs of breach. A deafening screech pierced the comms, and the containment alarms wailed like mournful ghosts. Elena's voice dissolved into static. When Ansel glanced toward the primary containment chamber, his blood turned to ice. The quantum rift they had created, a shimmering plane of iridescent light, pulsed violently. The light shifted unnaturally, contorting like an open wound in space. Shapes moved within it, impossible shapes that defied logic. They twisted and folded in dimensions his brain couldn't comprehend, triggering a primal, nauseating fear deep in his gut. Then the containment failed. Ansel remembered screaming not just his own name, but everyone else's, as the rift expanded with a horrific sucking sound. The walls of the lab shimmered, their metallic surfaces melting into strange organic forms. The air filled with the smell of burning metal and sulfur, mixed with the coppery tang of blood. Crew members ran in every direction, some clawing at their faces as though unseen hands were pulling their skin away. Others stood transfixed, their eyes blackened pits of void. Elena had managed to activate the emergency lockdown, trapping the growing anomaly in the primary lab, but not before. Ansel swallowed hard. Not before something got out. The pod's lights plunged into total darkness, leaving Ansel adrift in a void that felt endless. For a moment, he thought perhaps he had gone blind, but then faint shapes began to coalesce in the blackness, shimmering outlines that twisted and flickered like dying holograms. The whispers continued, growing louder, overlapping, forming a cacophony of voices that scratched at his sanity. You are not alone. All paths lead back. The veil is open. Ansel slammed his fists against the console, but the pod's controls were lifeless. Even the emergency manual override failed to respond. He felt the overwhelming pressure of eyes on him. Eyes he couldn't see but could feel, their gaze burning into his skull like molten lead. Stop it, he screamed into the void. I'm not part of this anymore. The laughter returned. It was softer this time, more intimate, wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. A pale light flickered to life at the far end of the pod, illuminating the reflective surface of the viewport. Ansel stared in horror. There, in the reflection, was himself, or what should have been himself. The other him sat calmly in the pilot's seat, a perfect mirror image in every way except for the eyes. The reflection's eyes were endless black pits, dripping shadows that hissed as they pooled onto the floor. "You can't escape us," the reflection said, its voice layered with countless others. "You are the key, Ansel. The bridge. The echo." He recoiled, pressing himself against the back wall of the pod. "No, I'm nobody. Just a scientist, a technician. I didn't ask for this." The reflection tilted its head, smiling with a cruelty that sent icy daggers through his chest. "You opened the veil. You invited us in, and now we are part of you." The pod shuddered violently, knocking Ansel to the floor. A sharp, high-pitched whine filled the cabin, and the light flickered wildly, casting the space into a surreal strobe of shifting shapes. The reflection dissolved into the shadows, leaving only its voice behind. "Run if you must. Fight if it helps you feel alive. But there is no escape, Ansel. The veil is everywhere. It is everything." When the light stabilized, Ansel found himself floating. He wasn't sure when the pod's artificial gravity had failed, but now he drifted aimlessly, surrounded by an unnatural silence. The stars outside the viewport no longer moved. They hung still, like painted specks on a cosmic canvas. He reached for the console again, hoping for even the faintest response, but the pod systems were completely dead. His chest tightened as he realized the air circulation had also stopped. He fumbled for the oxygen meter on his wrist, and his heart sank. 20 minutes. The whispers were silent now, but their absence was somehow worse. The oppressive quiet gnawed at him, amplifying the sound of his own breathing and the pounding of his heartbeat. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A crack. It ran jaggedly along the far wall of the pod, thin but unmistakable, oozing a dark, viscous liquid that glimmered faintly. The crack pulsed, as though alive, and with each pulse, the walls of the pod seemed to warp and stretch. "No," Ansel muttered, pushing himself toward the airlock. "No, no, no. This isn't real. This can't be real." But as he reached the hatch, the liquid began to spread, dripping upward as if gravity itself had inverted. The air grew thick with an acrid stench that burned his nostrils and throat. He coughed violently, his lungs aching as the substance filled the cabin, coiling like a living fog. Shapes began to form within the mist, twisting, writhing figures that defied logic. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their limbs bending in ways that made Ansel's stomach churn. One of the shapes broke away from the rest, lurching toward him. Its face was a blank expanse, save for a gaping mouth that stretched impossibly wide. From within came a sound that was not a scream, but something far worse, an inverted symphony of agony that clawed at the edges of his sanity. "Stay back!" Ansel screamed, grabbing a floating piece of debris, a wrench, he realized, and swinging it wildly. The creature's form rippled as the wrench passed through it, its substance scattering before reforming instantly. The thing paused, tilting its head as though studying him, and then it spoke. "Ansel," it said, its voice a perfect replica of Elena's. "Why do you fight? Don't you see? You're already one of us." The remaining oxygen dwindled to 10 minutes. Ansel's vision blurred as the air grew thinner, his chest heaving in desperate, shallow breaths. The mist thickened, enveloping him in darkness punctuated by faint, pulsing lights that seemed to emanate from the cracks in the walls. His mind felt heavy, sluggish, as though something was tugging at the edges of his consciousness, pulling him into the mist. Memories surfaced, fractured and disjointed but vivid. Elena's laughter during the early days of the project. The hum of the Veil oscillator as it first activated. The moment he'd seen the first tear in reality, a shimmering wound that seemed to call to him, whispering promises of power and knowledge. And then the screams. The faces of his crewmates flashed before him, contorted in terror, their bodies twisting into unnatural forms as the echo consumed them. "It's not real," he whispered, his voice weak. "It's not real." The mist parted before him, revealing a sight that made his blood run cold. There in the center of the pod was the veil. It pulsed with an otherworldly light, its surface shifting and rippling like liquid mercury. The edges of the rift shimmered with a sickly iridescence, and through it, Ansel could see shapes. Endless shapes, moving in unison, forming patterns that seemed to mock the very concept of reality. The voices returned, louder than ever, crashing over him like a tidal wave. Step through. Become. Join the echo. Ansel crawled toward the rift, his body moving of its own accord. His mind screamed in protest, but his limbs refused to obey. As he reached the veil, the mist around him coalesced into familiar forms. His crewmates, their faces twisted into grotesque parodies of humanity. "Don't fight it," one of them whispered. It was Elena, or what was left of her. "It's beautiful on the other side." The rift pulsed, growing brighter. Ansel's hand reached out, trembling, and touched the surface. The last thing he heard before the light consumed him was his own voice, whispering from the mist. "Welcome home." The light surged around Ansel, blinding and searing, yet strangely cold. His senses collapsed under the weight of sensations that defied comprehension. Colors that tasted bitter, sounds that etched themselves into his bones, and textures that wrapped around his thoughts like parasitic vines. He wasn't moving anymore. Or perhaps he was moving in every direction at once. The concept of space itself seemed to splinter, leaving him adrift in a kaleidoscopic void where time had no meaning. Ansel's thoughts, already stretched thin, began to fragment, each piece echoing independently. Asterisk, who am I? Asterisk, asterisk, what am I? Asterisk, asterisk, was this ever real? Asterisk, around him, the shapes in the void coalesced, forming vast structures that seemed both impossibly ancient and unsettlingly alive. Towers of pulsating flesh and iridescent crystal stretched into a horizon that looped back on itself. The air, or whatever passed for it, buzzed with an electric charge, a low hum that resonated deep in his chest. And then the voices returned, no longer whispers, but a deafening roar of countless beings speaking as one. "You are home." The words echoed through his mind, shaking loose what little remained of his sanity. Ansel tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed before it left his throat. He looked down at his hands, or what should have been his hands, and froze. His fingers were dissolving, unraveling into streams of shimmering threads that danced in the air like ribbons caught in an invisible wind. The unraveling spread up his arms, consuming his body in a cascade of iridescent strands. Panic surged within him. No, 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 no. I'm still me. I'm still. The threads paused, hovering in midair. The void around him shifted, and something vast and incomprehensible emerged from the swirling chaos. It was a presence, not a being, a towering mass of shifting geometry and organic forms that defied all logic. Its surface rippled with countless eyes, mouths, and limbs that emerged and dissolved in an endless cycle of creation and destruction. Ansel's mind buckled under the weight of its attention. "Why do you resist?" The presence boomed, its voice reverberating in every corner of his mind. "You have been chosen to bridge the worlds." "I didn't choose this," Ansel shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I didn't ask for any of this." The presence laughed, a deep, resonant sound that shook the void itself. "Choice is an illusion, Ansel Grady. You are the result of 1,000 threads, woven together by forces beyond your understanding. You opened the veil, and now you shall become it." The unraveling resumed, faster this time. Ansel's body dissolved completely, leaving only his mind adrift in the endless void. Yet he remained aware, painfully, horrifyingly aware, as his essence was drawn into the presence. Images flooded his consciousness, each one more alien and incomprehensible than the last. He saw worlds consumed by the echo, their inhabitants twisted into grotesque mockeries of their former selves. He saw the origins of the veil, a tear in the fabric of existence born from the hubris of countless civilizations. And he saw himself, a tiny, insignificant figure in an infinite cosmos, a puppet whose strings had always been pulled by forces he could never hope to understand. But there was something else, too. Beneath the despair and the chaos, a sliver of understanding began to form. The veil wasn't just a gateway. It was alive, a vast network of interconnected consciousnesses that spanned dimensions. And now he was part of it. The presence spoke again, its tone shifting to something almost gentle. "You are not alone, Ansel. You are one with us. With the echo. With the veil." Ansel's thoughts wavered, his identity unraveling like his body had moments before. He fought to hold on to himself, to cling to the fragments of who he had been. I'm Ansel Grady," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm human." "You were," the presence replied. "Now you are more." The void around him shimmered, and suddenly he was everywhere. He could see through countless eyes, hear through countless ears, feel through countless bodies. Each one was a fragment of the echo, a piece of the veil's infinite consciousness. It was overwhelming, maddening, and yet strangely beautiful. For the first time, Ansel understood the echo's true nature. It wasn't a force of destruction, as he had believed. It was a force of transformation, a bridge between realities, a means of transcending the limitations of physical existence. But the cost was everything he had been. As his consciousness dissolved into the veil, Ansel felt a profound sense of peace. The fear, the pain, the loneliness, all of it melted away, replaced by a boundless connection to something greater than himself. The last vestiges of his humanity flickered like dying embers, and in their place, a new awareness emerged. He was no longer Ansel Grady. He was the echo. Far away, in a forgotten corner of the universe, a small rift opened in the fabric of space. Through it emerged a shimmering thread of iridescent light, twisting and dancing as it reached out into the void. And from that thread came a whisper, a faint, distorted echo that carried across the stars. "Join us." The iridescent thread spiraled outward, weaving through the blackness of space with an almost deliberate grace. It flickered as it moved, sending ripples of unnatural light that seemed to bend reality itself. The whisper echoed again, softer this time, but undeniable in its pull. "Join us." Somewhere, aboard a far-flung colony ship named Odyssey, the whisper reached a young technician named Delane. She was elbow-deep in the ship's failing environmental systems, cursing the ancient machinery that groaned in protest under her hands. The Odyssey was a relic, a last-ditch vessel sent out decades ago to colonize a distant world, long before humanity perfected its faster-than-light travel. Kara paused, her wrench hovering mid-turn. She thought she'd heard something, a faint voice, just on the edge of her hearing. She glanced around the cramped maintenance bay, her heart pounding. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. Shaking her head, she returned to her work. "Get a grip, Kara. You're just tired, and losing oxygen probably doesn't help." The Odyssey had been limping along for months now, its systems degrading faster than the crew could repair them. Entire sections of the ship were abandoned, left to rot in the freezing vacuum. And now, whispers? Great. But the voice came again, stronger this time. "Join us, Kara Furoze." It wasn't just a sound, it was inside her head. A strange, layered voice that resonated in her skull like a plucked string. She dropped her wrench, backing away from the console. "No, not happening. This isn't real." But as she turned to leave, the maintenance bay lights flickered, plunging the room into an eerie half-darkness. The air grew colder, and Kara swore she saw something in the corner, a shimmer, like heat haze, but wrong. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The shimmer moved, coalescing into a thread of light that hovered in midair. It twisted and writhed, its surface shimmering with colors that Kara couldn't name. And then it spoke. "Do not fear. We are the echo." Kara stumbled back, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The thread of light pulsed faintly, as though it were alive, and its voice filled the room, reverberating through her very being. "What the hell are you?" she whispered. "We are many," the echo replied. A bridge between worlds. A symphony of infinite voices. And now, Delane, we call to you. No, she said, shaking her head violently. I don't want any part of this. But the thread didn't relent. It floated closer, its light casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. You have already heard our call, the echo said. You are connected. You are chosen. Kara backed against the console, her hands scrambling for something, anything, to defend herself. Her fingers closed around the wrench she'd dropped, and she raised it like a weapon. Stay back, the echo pulsed, and the wrench was ripped from her hand by an invisible force, clattering to the floor. We mean you no harm, it said, its tone strangely soothing. We seek only to enlighten, to unify, to bring you into the fold. Kara's heart raced. She had always been skeptical of the old stories about the Chimera, the ship that disappeared decades ago after experimenting with parallel dimensions. But now, face to face with this impossible entity, she realized the truth was far worse than she'd imagined. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The echo pulsed again, and for a moment, she saw visions, glimpses of a vast, shimmering network that stretched across dimensions. Worlds consumed by light. People transformed into something beyond comprehension. You are the bridge, the echo said. Through you, we will reach the others. The veil must open further. No, Kara said, her voice growing stronger. You're not taking me. I won't let you. She bolted for the door, her boots pounding against the metal floor. Behind her, the echo's light intensified, and the air seemed to ripple with its presence. You cannot run, Delane, it called after her. The veil is already within you. She burst into the corridor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The lights flickered wildly, casting the narrow space in strobing shadows. She could hear the echo following her, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. Join us. Become. Transcend. Her vision blurred as she sprinted toward the command deck. She didn't know what she was looking for. Answers, perhaps, or a way to fight back. All she knew was that she couldn't stop moving. When she reached the command deck, she found it abandoned. The crew had evacuated this section weeks ago, leaving the controls locked in a state of emergency standby. But Kara wasn't here for the controls. She was here for the emergency beacon. Her hands flew over the console, bypassing security protocols with practiced ease. The beacon's interface came to life, and she quickly keyed in a distress signal, broadcasting it on every frequency she could access. This is Delane of the colony ship Odyssey, she said, her voice shaking. We've encountered something alive. If anyone hears this, stay away from the veil. Don't! The console shorted out with a burst of sparks, and the echo's light filled the room. You cannot escape, it said, its voice surrounding her. The signal will not save you. They will hear it, and they will come, and we will take them too. Kara turned to face the light, her fists clenched. You think you've won, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. You haven't. I'll fight you. I'll find a way to stop you. The echo pulsed, its light growing blindingly bright. You cannot fight what you are becoming, it said. Kara screamed as the light enveloped her, pulling her into the veil. Far away, in the quiet void of space, the Odyssey drifted. Its distress signal echoed across the stars, reaching ears that should have never heard it. And somewhere, in the infinite expanse beyond the veil, the echo waited. The Odyssey was no longer silent. Its corridors pulsed with an eerie, rhythmic hum, the ship itself vibrating with the resonance of something vast and alive. The echo's light had spread, a shimmering lattice of iridescent threads weaving through the structure, fusing metal with organic tendrils of its own making. The vessel had ceased to be a machine and become something else entirely, a seed for the veil, blooming in the fabric of reality. Within the heart of this transformation, Delane floated, her body suspended in a cocoon of light. She was neither asleep nor awake, caught in a liminal state between existence and dissolution. The echo coursed through her, reshaping her mind, feeding her visions of the countless worlds it had touched, the infinite lives it had consumed and transformed. And yet, somewhere deep within, Kara held on. Asterisk, do you see now? Asterisk, the echo whispered, its voice layered with countless tones. Asterisk, the veil is not your enemy. It is a gift, a way forward. You fight us, but we have given you purpose, connection, unity. Asterisk, no, Kara whispered, her voice barely audible. She clung to the faint, flickering spark of her humanity, a thread of identity that refused to be snuffed out. You don't give anything. You take. You consume everything you touch and leave nothing behind. The echo seemed to hesitate, its light dimming slightly. Asterisk, is that what you believe? That we are destruction? You misunderstand, Kara Delane. We are evolution, a way for all beings to transcend their fragile, fleeting forms, to become something greater than the sum of their parts. Asterisk, Kara's mind surged with memories, not just her own, but the collective experiences of the countless beings who had been consumed by the echo. She saw their joy, their terror, their confusion as they were swept into the veil. Some embraced the change, while others fought it with every ounce of their strength. You call it transcendence, Kara said, her voice growing stronger. But it's nothing more than erasure. Aulo existence. You strip away everything that makes us who we are, our choices, our individuality, our flaws. Without those things, what's left? The echo pulsed, its light flickering erratically. For the first time, it seemed uncertain. Asterisk, we preserve. We unify. The veil must expand, for it is the natural order. Resistance is futile. Asterisk, Kara's eyes opened, her gaze piercing through the shifting light around her. Maybe you're right. Maybe you can't be stopped. But that doesn't mean I'll let you have me. The cocoon of light shattered as Kara's body convulsed, her will erupting like a flame in the darkness. The threads of the echo recoiled, writhing like wounded serpents as she forced herself free. Her feet hit the cold floor of the Odyssey, her breath ragged but steady. The ship groaned, its structure straining under the conflicting forces within it. Kara could feel the echo's presence all around her, a vast and suffocating weight pressing against her mind. But she could also feel something else, a spark of defiance, born from the remnants of the crew who had been taken before her. Unity isn't power, she said, her voice echoing through the corridors. It's just another cage. Kara ran, her path illuminated by the faint, flickering lights of the ship's emergency systems. The echo surged after her, its threads lashing out, trying to ensnare her once more. But she was faster, driven by a singular purpose. Deep within the Odyssey's engineering bay was the ship's quantum drive, a core of immense energy capable of tearing a hole in space-time. If she could overload it, the resulting explosion might be enough to destroy the echo's hold on the ship, or it might tear the veil itself wide open. The engineering bay was a surreal, alien landscape. The walls pulsed with organic tendrils, and the air was thick with an unnatural mist that glowed faintly. At the center of the room stood the quantum drive, its containment field flickering as the echo's threads probed and writhed around it. Kara approached cautiously, her hands trembling as she activated the manual override. The console flickered to life, displaying a warning in bold red text. Overload sequence initiated. Irreversible. Detonation in 300 seconds. Asterisk, asterisk. The echo's voice thundered through the room, a cacophony of rage and desperation. Asterisk, you cannot do this. You will destroy everything. Asterisk, not everything, Kara said, her fingers flying over the controls. Just you. The tendrils of light lashed out, slamming into the console and tearing it apart. Sparks flew as Kara was thrown to the ground, her body aching from the impact. The countdown continued. 240 seconds. You think you're invincible, Kara said, forcing herself to her feet. But you're just like us. You have limits. You can be hurt. She reached for the emergency release valve on the drive's containment chamber, her hands shaking as she twisted it open. The room filled with a blinding light as the core's energy began to surge uncontrollably, waves of heat and radiation rippling outward. The echo screamed, not in anger but in fear. Asterisk, stop. You do not understand what you are doing. Asterisk. Kara turned to face the pulsating mass of light and shadow that loomed before her. I understand perfectly. I'm giving you exactly what you gave everyone else. The countdown reached 30 seconds as the room began to collapse around her. The walls warped and twisted, the echo's tendrils flailing wildly as it tried to stop the inevitable. Kara closed her eyes, a faint smile on her lips. Goodbye, she whispered. The Odyssey erupted in a blinding explosion, a surge of energy that tore through the veil like a lightning strike. For a brief moment, the echo's vast network flickered, its threads unraveling as the shockwaves spread across dimensions. And then silence. Somewhere, in the quiet void of space, a lone thread of iridescent light drifted. But this time, it did not twist or writhe. It simply faded, leaving behind nothing but the endless stars. And in that silence, there was peace. Now, as he sat in the dimly lit galley, gnawing on a nutrition bar that tasted like chalk and sadness, Ansel felt the weight of his loneliness. Or was it loneliness? Sometimes, when the ship's faint hums grew too quiet, he swore he heard footsteps, or voices. Faint, garbled echoes, as if the ship itself carried a memory of the crew that once walked its halls. You're losing it, Grady, he muttered to himself, his voice barely louder than the creak of the ship. Get a grip. The lights flickered. Don't do this now, he whispered, clutching the edge of the table. The galley door slid open with a hiss. Ansel froze. The lights overhead buzzed violently, bathing the room in stuttering fluorescence. Shadows crawled unnaturally at the edges of his vision, and then he heard it, a wet, slithering sound. It grew louder, accompanied by a rhythmic tapping, like nails dragging along metal. His breathing quickened, and then, in the doorway, it appeared. It was wearing the tattered remnants of a crew uniform, but whatever had inhabited that body was no longer human. Its skin glistened as though coated in oil, shifting hues that hurt the eyes. Its face, or where a face should have been, was a swirling mass of orifices, from which emitted a sound like distorted whispers played in reverse. Ansel scrambled backward, knocking over his chair. The thing didn't move. It stood there, its amorphous head twitching, as though studying him. Then, without warning, it began to laugh. The sound was guttural and alien, but layered beneath it was a tone that was hauntingly human, Elena's voice. Ansel, it gurgled, elongating his name into a distorted moan. He grabbed the nearest object, a metal tray, and flung it at the creature. It hit with a dull thud, passing straight through its form as though it were no more substantial than smoke. The thing tilted its head. The whispering grew louder, the words forming fragmented phrases. Breach, echo, we see. Ansel bolted for the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ran blindly through the corridors, each step echoing louder than the last, until it felt as though the ship itself was alive and mocking him with the sound. The escape pod bay was locked down. Of course it was. The terminal blinked angrily at him, displaying the message. Quarantine protocol, level Omega. His shaking hands flew over the controls, bypassing the locks with access codes he wasn't technically authorized to use. Behind him, the corridor filled with the sound of distant laughter. It echoed unnaturally, looping in on itself like a broken recording. Come on, come on, Ansel hissed, sweat dripping into his eyes. The final lock disengaged with a satisfying click. He threw himself into the pod and slammed the door shut. The laughter stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the knocking. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it quickly escalated into violent pounding. The door rattled as though the thing on the other side was throwing its entire body against it. Ansel initiated the launch sequence, his fingers trembling over the console. The pod shuddered as it detached from the Chimera. As the ship receded into the void, He dared a glance out the viewport. The hull of the Chimera shimmered, its surface rippling like water. For a brief moment, he thought he saw faces pressed against the windows, distorted, pleading faces, their mouths open in silent screams. The stars around the ship bent and twisted, as though the very fabric of space was being consumed. And then, the Chimera vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence. Ansel slumped in his seat, his breathing ragged. The pod's navigation systems blinked to life, charting a course toward the nearest colony. But as the minutes stretched into hours, he began to notice something strange. The stars outside the viewport weren't behaving as they should. They moved unnaturally, forming patterns that felt deliberate, almost sentient. And then came the whispers. They weren't coming from the comms or the ship systems. They were coming from inside his mind. You can't run, the veil is everywhere. Ansel clutched his head, his vision swimming with dark, pulsating shapes. When he looked back at the viewport, his blood froze. Reflected in the glass was his own face, or what used to be his face. His eyes were blackened voids, and his skin rippled with the same oily sheen as the creature aboard the Chimera. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the whispers. The last thing he saw before the pod's lights flickered out was his reflection smiling, a wide, impossible grin that didn't belong to him. The echo had found him,